Good morning again. Let's continue our narrative of the Ottoman Empire. I think we will be able to finish today. Are there any matters you wish to discuss about the lectures or the syllabus, etc.? Okay. So we were discussing the millet system last time, and remember the four millets: self-governing autonomous communities, the Islamic, the Greek Orthodox, the Jewish, and the Armenian. And it's important to stress at the local level, these millets were more or less separated from one another. They were separate parts of town, if you like, and self-governing. The bishops, the priests, they were both religious leaders, and they also controlled the social life of the community. And the millet system was designed to sort of avoid friction between the different groups. And in that sense, I think it can be said over the many centuries, after all, the Ottoman Empire lasted a long time, it worked reasonably well. It was very unlike the Western towns and cities, which had municipal governments. Everybody was governed by the same local government. And indeed, in the cities in Western Europe, these cities had what we can call privileges, rights, liberties, and a real sort of self-conscious sense of civic pride. That was not the case. And I think that it reflects the weakness of the middle class in Ottoman society. Now, the only a real exception to this setup was in Istanbul itself, in the capital, because there the population was very mixed. Of course, there were Turks, but alongside the Turks were all the other groups: the Armenians, the Greeks, the Jews, and indeed Venetian merchants, and various sort of renegades from the West. There was a certain number of people who came from the West to sort of escape, for one reason or another, the authorities in the West, or they were running away for religious reasons. And so it was, I would say, a cosmopolitan city. People were mixed up with one another, and they interacted with one another in a cosmopolitan way. Well, that was exceptional. Now, while having said that there was, and this particularly sort of matured in the 18th and 19th centuries, and observers subsequently, or at the time and later, sort of commented on the sort of people left one another alone. There was a certain sort of interaction and cosmopolitanism, I would call it tolerance, that existed as the Ottoman Empire continued. And it was especially marked in the 19th century, where a lot of Europeans began to live in cities like Constantinople or Alexandria or Cairo. And indeed, in comparison to the sort of nationalism of the 20th and indeed the 21st century, some people feel a certain nostalgia for the toleration of the Ottoman Empire. That having been, are there any questions about these remarks? Very good. Now, having said that, and nevertheless, we have to point
Professor,
out. Yes.
sorry. Was it a like, was it a toleration or was it a camaraderie because they were all under the Ottoman Empire? Or was it more
Well,
like,
so in some places, um, there was an actual camaraderie. As time wore on, and the sort of religious differences, they were there, but they became somewhat less important. People interacted with one another, and there is a novel by an Englishman, actually a set of novels by an Englishman by the name of Lawrence Durrell, very beautiful novels. And he speaks about the sort of way of life that existed in these Ottoman cities. And if you had a little money and so on, you could live really well in the Ottoman Empire. There was a certain, and also, the Ottoman Empire, as we're going to see, it became, it was, from an economic point of view, a backwater. It was decadent. And some people sort of had a very, if you were a Westerner, it was a very pleasant cafe life, cafes, nightclubs, so on, very sort of enjoyable, cosmopolitan, the way Winnipeg should be. Let's put it that way. That's what it was like. But nevertheless, there was a certain amount of tension, and the tension grew out of the fact that the Western influence, and indeed Western power, was growing over time. By the 17th, 18th, and certainly 19th century, the Western influence and power over the Ottoman Empire grew. And as it grew, the situation for the Muslims and the Jews tended to deteriorate. And the Westerners, who had power, economic power, and even military power, as I'll note, they tended to favor the Greek Orthodox and the Armenian Christian population, especially the merchants. And the Muslim and the Jewish merchants lost out. There was a decline in their situation, whereas the Armenian and the Greek Orthodox merchants tended, the Venetians or the French, or even the English, as their influence grew, they tended to favor them. And one of the ways that this reflected itself, especially in the 17th century and on into the 18th, was persecution of the Jews. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this. Of course, the persecution of the Jews, I would say that Western Europe, especially in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, or I should say Europe in general. Why should I mean, places like Russia and elsewhere in the eastern part of Europe were quite bad for the Jews as well. And I would say they were generally worse than they were in the Ottoman Empire. But as this, particularly this rivalry, commercial rivalry between the Christian merchants and the Jewish merchants, it led to what I would call sort of what are referred to as riots and persecutions of the Jews. They're referred to as pogroms, actually. It's, I think, an Eastern European word. And one of the features of this was the so-called blood libel, the so-called blood libel. And this had developed during the European Middle Ages in 14th and 15th century Europe, but it spread into the Ottoman Empire. And this was the allegation that the Jews kidnapped little boys and they murdered them and used their blood to prepare for the Passover Seder. this is known as the blood libel, and it started in Europe, but it perpetuated itself, particularly, it died out in the West, in Eastern Europe, and certainly in the Russian Empire. It was a problem in the Russian Empire as late as the beginning of the 20th century. But it did play a part in the Ottoman Empire, and it was raised against the Jews as part of the kind of commercial rivalry. If you see, you just sort of denounce the Jews as murderers and so on. Well, it reflects itself in terms of the attitude of the judges, the courts, commerce, and so on. The more so as the Venetians or the French tended to sort of support these allegations against the Jews. On the one hand, the Armenian and the Greek Orthodox merchants, because of their contacts with the West Europeans, did better. And I would say that the Jews and the Muslims did worse. And as a matter of fact, because they were both miserable, the Jews and the Muslims, they got along pretty well, I would say, more so than in Western Europe. So this brings me to the whole important question of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. You see that it rose dramatically in the 15th century. It reached its height in the 16th century under Solomon the Magnificent. But then things deteriorated. The clear signs of decay, of decline, developed at the end of the 16th and 17th century. And this decline continued into the 18th and 19th century, especially relative to Western Europe, as Western Europe, and particularly the Northern European countries, forged ahead. As the Atlantic economy grew, the Mediterranean shriveled, became secondary, and indeed became vulnerable to Western imperialism or colonialism, we can say, and more about that in a few minutes. So the question is, what were the reasons for this? What were the reasons? And I would point out that this is a review question. And so the review question, actually, if I can find it, yes, the review question, if you look down your list, there's a review question called Explain the Decay of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm going to deal with this whole question of the decay or the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which is a review question. And so it's important. It could appear on the examination, for example. So pay attention to this. I'm going to discuss.
Well, maybe he'll learn it all.
Hello?
This year?
Hello? Oh, okay. Somebody just outcried. There was some kind of an outcry just now. Who knows what anguish you students are in? I can't even say. In any case, for one thing, I want to say to begin with, it took the people began to speak about the decay of the Ottoman Empire already in the 17th century. But it went on into the 18th and 19th centuries, and the Ottoman Empire only fell in 1918, if you can believe it. By the 19th century, they were referring to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, the sick man of Europe. In other words, the question is, the Ottoman Empire is sick, when will it die? And sure enough, it died in 1918. That was the end of but it took a long time. So we're not talking about the fall of the Ottoman Empire, because it's not, that's 20th century. We're just talking about the decay or the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And in this respect, it's important to note that it wasn't only the Ottoman Empire that was affected by this. If you look at Italy, which was the foremost economic entity in Europe in the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, it too visibly declined from the 17th century onwards. And the same thing is true of Spain. So in other words, it wasn't the decay of the Ottoman Empire wasn't unique to it alone. Italy and Spain declined likewise, and which gives you a basic, the underlying reason is clear enough. The Ottoman Empire fundamentally declined because the Atlantic took over. The Mediterranean route to Asia, all of that gradually withered. And the Atlantic route and the nations like Holland and England and France, which were along the Atlantic, they were the beneficiaries. And the Ottoman Empire, Spain and Italy, were the losers in this situation. So that I think is the fundamental reason. But added to that was the fact that as the Ottoman Empire got into difficulty, and as the West European economies, the French, the Dutch, and the English economies got stronger and stronger, they began to penetrate into the Mediterranean. And with their big warships and with their manufactured products, they began to bully the Ottomans. They began to, in other words, we have Western colonialism, we have Western imperialism. And the Ottoman Empire basically became a dependency of the West, just like Latin America. A process of dependency, of exploitation developed, which is similar to what happened in Latin America. And of course, we're going to see the same thing in Africa and ultimately in Asia with respect to China. It's the same process, a process that sometimes is referred to as unequal exchange. The West was able to economically dominate and basically exploit the dependent economy of the Middle East. And that situation has continued right up to the present. This is the real situation. So I would say, number one is the decline of the Mediterranean economy and the rise of the Atlantic. And following from which you have Western colonialism and imperialism as being very important. But there are internal factors which are very important as well, which should certainly be mentioned. And we could begin by being personal. That is to say, following the death of Solomon the Magnificent, the sultans who followed tended to be weaker and indeed oftentimes incompetent. And the politics of the palace, the politics of the harem with its slaves and eunuchs and many wives living in the harem, the sultans began to become manipulated by the court, the rivalries of the court, and it became corrupt. There was favoritism. There was what is referred, favoritism is often referred to as nepotism, favoritism, corruption, intrigue, and so on. this became characteristic of the court um, in the decades following Solomon the Magnificent. And I would just stop at this point and talk about the relationship between a society in trouble and its leaders. Strong societies tend to have strong leaders. Weak societies tend to have weak leaders. In other words, there's this kind of a very subtle and it's difficult to sort of pin down relationship between the overall strength of a society and the kinds of leaders that rule over the society. The weakness of rulers tends to sort of, it doesn't always apply, obviously, but it tends to be related to the sort of weakness of the society as a whole. Let me give you an example. Before the Russian Revolution, for example, well, the ruling dynasty were the Romanovs. And at one time, the Romanovs, with somebody like Peter the Great, so on, Catherine the Great, they were powerful monarchs in the late 17th, 18th century. But by the time you get to the revolution, you have this Nicholas II on the throne, and he's a weakling, and he's under the control of this crazy guy, Rasputin, and so on. And so the same thing in the French Revolution. 1789, the ruler was Louis XVI. He doesn't compare with his grandfather, Louis XIV. He was a weakling. He wasn't really interested in political life. He was interested, he had little toys, clocks, that's what he liked. And so there's this sort of relationship. And certainly I would say, for example, if you look at somebody like Trump or Biden, both of them in their different ways. Obviously, somebody like Trump was completely crazy, but maybe I'm offending some of you. In any case, there is this subtle relationship. I'm saying but I think it does exist. Any questions about what I've said? So I've been talking about the rise of the Atlantic and the decline of the Mediterranean. I talked about Western imperialism and colonialism. Now I'm talking about the court and the problems with the court, the sort of the degeneration of the rulers, of the self. But given this situation, in terms of the situation of the Ottoman leadership, the sultans, under these circumstances, how did they respond to their growing problems? Well, one of the problems was the Ottoman establishment was expensive to keep up the state, to keep up the military, and to keep up the luxury of the way of life of the court. You needed a lot of money. Well, with the decline of the economy, the money wasn't there. So how did the sultans respond? They ordered their tax gatherers to basically take it out of the hides of the merchants, of the craftsmen, of the peasants, the great majority of the subjects of the sultan. These were the productive classes. Instead of supporting them, instead of reinforcing them, the sultans overtaxed them, overexploited. There's a process of overexploitation. And it led to a decline of the productive economy. It's basically what went on. And so this, there were, as a result, there were many increasing numbers of poor people who flocked into the cities into the slums of the cities. There was a great deal of criminality. In the countryside, there were bandits. And so these were the growing problems that were faced by the Ottomans. And indeed, this was intensified by the fact that the local officials, who at the time of Suleiman the Magnificent or Selim or Mehmed II, were terrified of the Sultan, terrified of punishment. Increasingly, they went their own way. The local officials became unreliable, they became corrupt, they made their own side deals. And so local government control over the state deteriorated in this way. I think one last point I would make about all this is I want to come back to the question of religion. I already was critical that Islam was a fundamentalist religion, and the idea of reason and science it had been in the old Arab empires of the 8th to the 10th century, science had flourished. But from about the 10th century onwards, Islam became increasingly intolerant of science and reason. And this did not change under the Ottomans. And while in the West, science and reason from the 16th century, of course, there were problems. Look at what happened when Copernicus published his work in 1543. He was terrified that he would be persecuted by the popes, and certainly was denounced by Luther and Calvin. The idea that the Earth rotated around the sun, forget it. And of course, Galileo was persecuted by the church. So there were a lot of problems in the West, but eventually science and reason became a new culture in the West. By the late 17th century, you have Isaac Newton and what's called the culture of reason and the Enlightenment in the West. Nothing like that happened in the Ottoman Empire. No, it just the fundamentalism hung on. It still hangs on. I'm exaggerating because I did note that there was a process of modernization from the 19th century onwards, of course, but it's problematic. And let me illustrate this. For example, in the West, from the 16th century onwards, if you lived in a place like Zurich or Lyon in France and so on, one of the prides of the city was the city clock. Now, clocks, they had been invented during the Middle Ages, but they really came into their own during the Renaissance. Any town worthy of its name built a clock tower. And everybody could tell time. And you could make appointments. People began to sort of organize their day. I have to go to my appointment, except I have to see my dentist. That mentality developed from the 16th century onwards, or I have to go to work. That kind of idea, work ethic begins to develop. Well, in the Islamic world, there were many towers in the towns, but they were prayer towers, called to prayer. People were called to prayer 3 times a day. Clock towers weren't allowed. And even worse was the fact that whereas in the West, from the late 15th, 16th century, there were literally hundreds of printing presses established all over Western Europe as the printed book came in. And people, especially the middle class, began to send their kids to school because literacy became important. Books were accessible. And so what you have is rising rates of literacy in the West based on the printed word. Well, there were no printing presses allowed except those that printed the Quran in Constantinople. It was not until the 18th century that private printing presses were allowed in the Ottoman Empire. So you can see there were problems. Any questions about what I've been saying? Okay, so let's come back to the question of sort of Western dominance.
Professor.
Yes.
So to very briefly summarize, the Ottoman Empire began to fall behind in terms of trade. It also had a weakened court, and it fell behind socially because it refused to adopt things like clocks, books.
Yes, but also the common people, the productive people, were taxed by heavy taxation.
Right, and then they were unsupported because of the corrupt courts as well.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
But also, and I'm just reiterating the point I made earlier, that the Westerners, the French, the English, and the Dutch, they sent their warships in the 17th century. Western manufactured goods began to penetrate. The Ottomans were sort of forced to sign commercial treaties which favored Western manufacturers. And indeed, they even signed treaties which allowed the Westerners to be exempt from the judicial system of the Turks. Special courts were set up in the main port cities. These treaties were known as capitulation treaties, and the French, the British, the Dutch had their own courts where their subjects were exempt from Ottoman law, which gives you a sense of the weakness of the Ottoman state. Now, as I said, in particular, the Armenian and the Greek Orthodox merchants had it better. The Jews and the Muslims, it was not good. The situation for them was deteriorating. So what you find starting in the 17th century is that certain religious tendencies begin to develop amongst the Muslims. There is a kind of spread of mysticism. Mysticism begins to develop. Whereas previously, Sunni Islam had been a sort of strongly fundamentalist and legalist sort of religiosity, you find that Sufism, it's called Sufism, it's sort of religious mysticism, becomes more and more popular amongst people. They turn away from the realities of this world, and they begin to sort of cultivate the inner life and so on. And amongst the Jews, it's even, well, it's, I'm trying to find, yeah. Can you see the screen?
Yes. Professor,
Yes.
when you say that people turn to mysticism, who turned to mysticism?
Well, even the soldiers, the Janissaries, for example, the sort of cult of mysticism developed. Have you ever heard of the whirling dervishes? You've heard this, the whirling dervishes. It's kind of mystical, sort of trance-like dance. People whirl around and fall into a kind of ecstatic state. It became very popular amongst the Janissaries.
But this is universally on the Ottoman side of things,
Yes,
right?
yes, that's right.
Okay, got
It's
it.
on the Ottoman side. Amongst the Jews, it was in a way, what happened to them was, in response to the persecutions, was that in what used to be, well, it's now Croatia, there was this learned young man who may have been a little bit mentally sick, he suddenly claimed that he was the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. You understand what I'm saying? The idea that there was going to be a Messiah dates back to the time of Jesus, and Jesus was the Messiah and founded the Christian religion. Well, the Jews rejected this, right? They had their own rabbinical Judaism. So it went on like that for centuries. Well, suddenly at the end of the 17th century, this character, Sabbatai Sevi, comes out and he says, well, I'm the Messiah. And the Jews go wild. In the synagogues all over the Ottoman Empire and into Western Europe, places like Holland, the Jews are dancing in the streets. The Christians are amazed at what's going on. And so the Sultan hears about this. He calls Sabbatai Sevi to Istanbul and he appears before the Sultan. The Sultan says, listen, unless you convert to Islam this instant, I'm going to cut off your head. And so Sabbatai Sevi does so. And this is a huge scandal and disappointment. All of the Jewish population are stunned. And indeed, they try to sort of obliterate the memory of all of this. But it did happen.
So it drove further separation within the Ottoman Empire?
Well, more complicated. What happened, I'm just giving you this as an example of the sort of religious excesses that were going on because of the problems in the society. And in this case, it was anti-Semitism. So what happened here was most of the Jews, of course, just went back to rabbinical Judaism, but some of the followers of Sabbatai Sevi, they became Muslims. They followed Sabbatai Sevi, and these Jews who converted to Islam became a sect within Islam that survived into the 20th century. They still exist. They're called the Domer, these people who secretly practice sort of Jewish practices, but they are ostensibly Muslims. That does exist. Actually, we have this idea that Judaism sort of remained just within this sort of rabbinical Judaism is the norm, and that's it. No, that's not true. All sorts of things happened, particularly in the 18th century. I don't have time to go into this, but there is this kind of interesting aspect of things. So there was that. Well, there was an attempt under a sultan by the name of Mehmed IV to turn things around, to restore the Ottoman Empire. He lived in the middle of the 17th century. Mehmed IV, there was Mehmed II, and now we have Mehmed IV. And he tried reform and renewal. And the first thing he did was he launched a campaign against corrupt officials, members of the army. They were dismissed. Some of them were executed as examples. That was number one. But the other thing was, he said, let's go back to the jihad. Let's go back to the jihad. Restore, just like Solomon the Magnificent, we're going to launch jihad against the Christians. So he tries to galvanize the population. This is the idea of demonstrating the superiority of the Ottoman way by a kind of revival. Now, this kind of revivalism is not uncommon. We see, for example, and you'll see in the history of China, when they were confronted with the West, or they had problems, returning to the old ways was the answer. This is a very common pattern in history. when empires and kingdoms are challenged, the first instinct is to go back to the old ways. So this is kind of a revivalism, if you like. As a matter of fact, we have an example even in our own time. What do you think neoliberalism was all about? It's literally new liberalism. Liberalism was the economic doctrine that developed in the West, that is to say, free enterprise, at the beginning of the 19th century, especially in England and in the United States. Well, lo and behold, when capitalism gets into trouble in the 1960s, there is this attempt to revive liberalism. Free enterprise is the answer. And this is what the state goes for. This is what the university professor teaching economics for the main part go for, and they impose it on the rest of the population. It's an attempt to sort of revive the good old days. I don't think it's working, but I'm giving you an example of this kind of a tendency for society which feels under pressure to revive itself by, instead of sort of creating something new, you retreat into sort of the old ways. So this is what was tried. And so there was a certain success on the part of Mehmed II because he was able to, in fighting a long war against the Venetians, he took over a lot of the islands of the Mediterranean that had remained under the control of the Venetians, especially one of the largest islands, Crete, was conquered by the Turks during the reign of Mehmed. But he finally, the Ottomans finally decided, well, we're going, like Solomon the Magnificent, we're going to cross Hungary and we're going to besiege Vienna. We'll show these Western Europeans a thing or two. Where just like in 1529, Solomon wasn't able to take Vienna, but this time, 1683, we're going to succeed. So they raised a huge army. They sent it against, this is the second siege of Vienna. And the Austrians, the Habsburgs sitting in Vienna, they appealed to the other German princes, to the King of Poland, to various other princes, the West Europeans, who are now, in terms of their military technology, 1683, the European armies have become highly sophisticated armies. The rifles that they use are far superior, the cannon are far superior to anything that the Turks have. And the Turks are slaughtered. At the second siege of Vienna in 1683, they are humiliated. And from that point onwards, things go from bad to worse, because the Habsburgs, and then joined by the Russians, who themselves, in the late 17th, early 18th century, under this powerful Tsar, Peter the Great, creates a great military force, a fleet and an army. So the Austrians and the Russians, they, from the beginning of the 18th century, they launch huge attacks on the Turks, and they virtually drive them out of the Balkans. The southern Balkans remains Turkish, but the rest falls to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Russians take the Ukraine, they take the Caucasus, they take the area north of the Black Sea. The Russian state, with its modern army, the Turks cannot withstand this. So the Turks, although they try, do I still have, yeah, I have a couple of minutes. In the face of these defeats, the Turks try to modernize their army. They invite Western commanders to train their army and so on. But it doesn't work because the Janissaries and the Turkish cavalry say nothing doing. We refuse. The old ways are the best. And so the attempt to sort of modernize the Turkish army doesn't succeed, and the advance of the Russians and the sort of Austrian Habsburgs continues. Indeed, by the end of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire is reeling, and the humiliation goes so far that Napoleon Bonaparte, the great general of the French Revolution of 1789, he actually, in the 1790s, invades Egypt and conquers Egypt for a while, which sort of forecasts what's going to happen in the 20th century. That is to say, Western imperialism will basically take over the Middle East. So things are extremely serious. And indeed, and here I'm sort of winding up. Following Napoleon scuttles back to France and ultimately becomes Emperor of France. So he leaves. But things get worse because in Egypt, in the opening years of the 19th century, a military commander by the name of Muhammad Ali, like the boxer, Muhammad Ali, he basically declares independence from the Ottoman Empire, and he sets up an independent state in Egypt. And this guy is a reformer because he takes land away from the landlords and gives it to the peasants. He even tries to set up cotton factories to process the raw cotton that is being produced in Egypt. He's trying to industrialize Egypt. Well, the Ottomans, with the help of the British, they crush him. But nevertheless, there's a secession. And then the Russians in the 1820s, they intervene in order to support the independence of the Greeks. There was a revolution in Greece in the 1820s, and it's at that point that the Greeks recovered their independence. Well, I'll wind things up on Monday, and we'll proceed to India. Onward to India, tour of the world.